In the bright, cold heart of Sterling Industries, I, Francis Dawn, sat perfectly still. My boss, Roy Rice, stood across the long mahogany table. His face was red and tight with a cruel kind of joy. The whole boardroom was watching, a ring of silent, fearful faces. "You're fired," Roy spat the words out like stones, leaning forward with a sneer that made his neck veins bulge. "Get your things and get out. You'll never work here again." He was trying to crush me, to humiliate me completely in front of the people I had worked beside for 10 years. But I wasn't crushed. My mind was perfectly calm, almost clear as glass. I gave him a small, quiet smile that I knew unsettled him more than any shouting match would have. The irony of the moment was so thick I could almost taste it. He had just fired the person who legally owned the chair he was sitting in, the room he was standing in, and the very company that paid his salary. He thought he had destroyed me. He had no idea what he had actually done. I stood slowly, not rushing, and walked out without a word, letting my calm confidence be the last thing they remembered. If you're watching this, subscribe, like and let me know where you're watching from. The moment I was safe in my car, parked 3 blocks away, I pulled out my laptop. I didn't drive straight home. I needed to see the proof again, the documents that Roy believed were safely locked away. With quick fingers, I navigated to an encrypted folder hidden deep within my system. The files bloomed on the screen, cool blue light reflecting in my eyes. There it was, the truth. The legal documents proved I secretly inherited 75% of Sterling Industries through my late grandfather's trust. Grandpa John Paul had been the true founder, and he had set up the papers to protect the company from men exactly like Roy. But there was a catch, a vital lock on the golden door. The paperwork wasn't fully activated yet. It needed one last, critical signature. To transfer the shares from the blind trust to my direct name. That final paper was the one missing piece, the key to total, unquestionable control. Roy didn't know it existed, or he would have destroyed it already. The tension in my chest was immediate. I knew exactly where that final document was. Roy had it locked away in a private, double-secured safe in his office vault, believing it was the only thing standing between him and being the true king of Sterling. My mind replayed the last few months, a mental video of Roy's betrayal. I remembered the whispers, the closed-door meetings, and the sudden shift of the board's loyalty. It wasn't an accident, it was a planned attack. Roy had worked tirelessly, planting lies about my job performance and spreading rumors of mismanagement to paint me as the failing executive who needed to be removed. He pushed the narrative to make his firing of me seem justified, even necessary. But the deeper, uglier truth was the one he hid most carefully. He had been secretly siphoning company money, using Sterling's funds to bankroll his excessively luxurious lifestyle, private jets, exotic homes, and massive gambling debts. He was robbing the company blind and needed me out of the way before I discovered the scale of his fraud. The realization made my quiet rage burn a little hotter. He was a thief and a liar. I closed the laptop, letting the screen go black. I took a deep breath. I wouldn't fight back right now. I wouldn't expose him yet. I decided to let Roy feel the false warmth of victory. I would let him believe he'd won. Completely, for the brief, sweet moment he had left before I pulled the rug out from under his entire world. Roy couldn't stop talking about it. He bragged to everyone who would listen about his decisive action and trimming the fat. He called me incompetent and a failure, celebrating my firing as his personal victory. But that initial, quiet smile I had given him was a seed of doubt, and it had sprouted into a full-blown weed of worry in his mind. He found himself constantly looking over his shoulder. He felt like he was being watched. The paranoia reached a fever pitch late that week. He was reviewing some building access logs, a routine check he usually ignored when his eyes snagged on an impossible detail. The digital record showed that my security access code to the executive level and the confidential server room had never been revoked. My name still appeared on the system as an active user with full permissions. How the hell did he still get in? Roy shouted at his chief of security, a man named Silas. Silas could only stammer that the system showed the firing, but the permissions update hadn't processed. Roy knew it was a lie, or at least a cover story. The knowledge that I still had access, or that the system still thought I did, made him frantic. He started changing his passwords multiple times a day, but the damage was done. The seed of doubt was now a chilling certainty. I knew something he didn't. Roy's mind became a maze of suspicion. He started losing sleep, walking the halls late at night, checking door locks and server lights. His employees, already unnerved by his erratic behavior, started whispering. The rumors only fueled his panic. They said my name, Francis Dawn, was still popping up on highly confidential project files, sometimes appearing as the last person to save a document, or the one to approve a final change. He was convinced I was still there, a ghost haunting the corporate structure he thought he controlled. His paranoia was further justified when the company began to feel a subtle, creeping pressure from the financial markets. A new anonymous investor had started buying up small but significant amounts of Sterling's shares. Not enough to cause an alarm, but enough to feel like a slow, steady tightening around his throat. Roy ordered his financial team to find the buyer, but the trail was perfectly hidden, untraceable. He slammed his fist down on his desk in frustration. He didn't know the buyer's identity, but I did. The mystery investor buying up all those shares was actually a silent shell company I had established under my grandfather's instructions years ago, precisely for a moment like this. The control was not just coming from the top, it was also being quietly absorbed from the bottom. The moment arrived with a quiet, satisfying thunder. I returned to Sterling HQ, not sneaking in, but walking right through the front doors. My face was calm, my posture relaxed. I wasn't there as Francis Dawn, the fired executive. I was there as a consultant sent directly by the board's Financial Oversight Committee. I carried a single leather briefcase, and my entry was both formal and undeniable. Roy saw me step out of the elevator and practically exploded. His face, already pale from lack of sleep, turned a deep, unhealthy purple. "You," he bellowed, rushing toward me. "What in the hell do you think you're doing? I had you fired." I simply met his eyes, my calm confidence a solid shield against his uncontrolled aggression. I presented my board-issued temporary badge. The staff, who had gathered in small knots, watched the exchange, sensing a major power shift happening right before their eyes. They could see the difference. The man who was in control was the one who was calm, not the one who was screaming. Roy finally backed off, spitting out threats under his breath. As he stormed away, my phone vibrated in my pocket. The message was short, cryptic, and sent my heart rate soaring. The signature's ready. The last piece of the puzzle had just clicked into place. I met with Joy Vega, a sharp corporate lawyer and the only person outside of my grandfather who knew the full extent of the truth. She had been my late grandfather John Paul's most trusted confidant, the executor of his final wishes. Her office was small and clean, a welcome change from the chaos of Sterling HQ. She smiled warmly and confirmed the good news: the final signature had been secured. The key to the kingdom was now fully mine. We reviewed the entire stack of documents once more. Joy then revealed a chilling detail. Roy, in his desperation, had actually attempted to have me legally declared unfit to inherit the shares. He had tried to manipulate the legal system with false reports of emotional instability, hoping to keep the 75% stake permanently locked in the blind trust, where he could control it indirectly. He almost succeeded, Joy said, her voice dropping. But the papers your grandfather drafted were ironclad. They were legally binding and completely unassailable. She slid the final stack of signed, stamped documents across the table. They felt heavy in my hands. With that one, powerful gesture, the power shifted, the shares were fully transferred. Francis Dawn was no longer the fired executive. I was the 75% owner of Sterling Industries, and Roy didn't even know he had lost the fight yet. The silent coup began immediately. I didn't announce my new status. I simply started to restructure the company from the deepest shadows, using my new legal authority without fanfare. Roy still strutted around, barking orders and believing he was the sole master of his domain. But the board members, who were also aware of the new consultant's power, began to subtly defer to me instead of him. When Roy would demand a new budget, the CFO would look at me for a confirming nod. When Roy would schedule a meeting, the VP of operations would check my calendar first. The tension became a silent, living thing that filled every room we shared. The climax of this quiet power game came during the signing of a massive, multi-million-dollar contract with an international client. Roy, puffing up his chest, reached for the pen. But the client's representative calmly slid the contract over to me, Francis Dawn, the consultant, saying, "We'll need Mr. Hayes to sign off first." My signature was not just a formality, it was an act of ownership. The room went dead silent. Roy's face twitched. The press, who were taking photos, started to whisper among themselves. Later that night, my phone was buzzing with questions. The media was beginning to ask the ultimate question: who's the real owner of Sterling? The truth finally broke through with a deafening, public crash at the annual company gala. The event was a shimmering sea of expensive suits and formal dresses, and Roy was swimming in it, arrogant and loud. He had too many glasses of expensive scotch and was drunkenly boasting to a small circle of reporters about owning the future of Sterling. He was detailing his vision and taking full credit for the company's recent modest success. Suddenly, one of the sharpest journalists, a woman named Lois, stepped forward. She politely but firmly corrected him. "Mr. Hale," she said, her voice carrying across the quiet hum of the room, "isn't the majority shareholder actually Francis Dawn?" She didn't wait for him to answer. Instead, she announced that a leaked document, planted by Joy and me, of course had just been published online, clearly revealing my name as the majority shareholder with the 75% stake. The entire room went instantly silent. The glittering noise of the party died. Roy, mid-sentence, froze. His face completely drained of color, going from drunken crimson to a shocking, sickly white. A sudden burst of frantic camera flashes lit up his terrified face like a spotlight, capturing the exact moment his world ended. Roy, fueled by panic and a rapidly fading drunken confidence, stormed into my new, official office the next morning. He didn't bother knocking. His eyes were wild, and he was screaming accusations, throwing papers, and calling me every name he could think of. He felt a deep, personal sense of betrayal, as if I were the one who had stabbed him in the back. I remained perfectly calm, sitting behind the large desk that was now legally mine. I let him vent his fury, watching the show with a cool detachment. When he finally paused, panting and out of breath, I looked him straight in the eye. My voice was low, clear, and quiet. "You fired me, Roy," I said, a faint smile touching my lips. "You didn't betray me. You freed me. You made me act." The power dynamic flipped completely in that moment. He was no longer the imposing boss, he was a trapped, cornered animal. My calmness was his undoing. Suddenly, his anger changed tactics. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You think you've won? I know everything about you, Hayes. I'll expose your family's dark secret. It's not over." The threat was chilling, but I didn't flinch. I just nodded slowly. Roy didn't realize that the dark secret he threatened to expose was actually the very thing that would destroy him. The hidden past that Roy believed was my weakness was actually my greatest weapon. He started to loudly proclaim a supposed scandal involving my late father, Arthur Hayes. The lie Roy spread was that my father, also an executive at Sterling decades ago, had embezzled millions before his mysterious death. Roy thought this rumor would turn the board and the public against me, proving I came from a family of criminals. He believed that this revelation would tarnish my image beyond repair and force me to sell my shares. But I had spent the past few years quietly, methodically digging into the past, following the instructions my grandfather had left for me. I knew the devastating truth: Roy had masterminded the entire scandal. He had framed my father years ago to remove him as a rival and clear the path for his own ascent to power. He had used fake accounting records and manipulated witnesses to make it look like my father was the culprit, completely destroying his reputation and ultimately leading to my father's tragic end. I had kept my knowledge a secret, waiting for the perfect moment. Roy had just given me that moment. He had brought up the very past he thought would destroy me, not realizing that I now possessed the absolute, undeniable proof that he was the actual villain. My next move was not aggressive. It was a deadly, carefully laid trap. I organized a fake apology dinner, sending Roy an email suggesting we should bury the hatchet and figure out a transition plan for his departure. Roy, blinded by his own arrogance and desperation, fell for it immediately. He believed he could still salvage something, perhaps a golden parachute or a promise of silence. I chose a quiet, expensive restaurant and wore a small, nearly invisible recording device hidden beneath my jacket lapel. During the dinner, Roy started drinking heavily again. As the liquor loosened his tongue, he couldn't help but brag about his past manipulations. He detailed exactly how he framed my father, how he lied to the police, and how he had manipulated the board over the years to keep himself in control. He laughed loudly as he recalled pushing my father out, completely oblivious to the small red light blinking on my chest. "I made your father a pariah, a joke," he boasted, slamming his glass down. He also detailed how he used the company's money for his offshore accounts. I just sat there, nodding and watching, letting him sign his own death warrant with every loud, boastful word. When he finally finished, I leaned in close to the recorder. "You just confessed to everything, Roy," I whispered, and his face instantly paled. The climax of the takeover happened at an emergency board meeting the following afternoon. I walked in with Joy, my legal team, and a small, secure speaker. Roy was already there, defensive and tense, trying to assert his authority one last time. I didn't waste any time with speeches. "Roy, you are a thief and a fraud," I announced to the room. I then simply pressed play on the recording device. Roy's drunken voice filled the tense silence, describing his crimes in vivid, damning detail. The board members listened in horrified silence as the full extent of his deceit, his theft of company funds, and the framing of my innocent father was laid bare. When the recording finished, the room was silent for a long minute. The board had already been leaning toward me, and this confession was the final, irreversible push. The vote was immediate, swift, and unanimous to remove Roy Rice from all executive positions and commence legal proceedings. The meeting was over. Roy stood up, his chair scraping loudly across the polished floor. He was defeated, but not broken. He met my eyes with pure, venomous hatred. "I'm not leaving," he spat, his voice trembling. "I'm not going anywhere." Despite the unanimous vote and the damning recording, Roy refused to accept defeat. He was desperate and dangerous. He ran straight back to the executive suite and barricaded himself inside. He wasn't planning a siege, he was planning digital warfare. His final, pathetic act of malice was to start systematically deleting every file he could access on Sterling servers. He was erasing years of records, client lists, and confidential project data, determined to take the company down with him in a chaotic fire of missing information. I stood outside the steel-reinforced door with Silas, the head of security, calmly listening to the muffled shouts and frantic typing. My face remained unreadable. Roy believed he was destroying the company, but he was simply wasting his final minutes of freedom. Long before I officially revealed my ownership, I had anticipated exactly this kind of desperate move. My team, working in total secrecy, had already executed a full system-wide backup. Every piece of data, every single file Roy was frantically trying to erase, was safely copied and secured on an offline, external server farm. The company was safe, and the drama was just for show. Silas finally broke the door lock, and we walked in. Roy was sitting at his computer, his hands flying over the keyboard, but he was too late. He was staring at a blank screen. Roy was quickly dragged out of the building by security, kicking and screaming useless threats into the empty air. The spectacle was ugly, and while it marked my undeniable victory, the celebration was short-lived. The fallout was immediate. As Joy and I began the process of forensic accounting to assess the damage, we discovered Roy's final, hidden crime. He hadn't just used company money, he had been incredibly good at hiding the trail. He had siphoned off millions over the past few years, moving the money through a complex network of shell companies and international bank transfers. The money was now sitting safely in offshore accounts, completely beyond the reach of Sterling's corporate law. The victory felt hollow. I had the company, but a massive hole had been blown in the company's finances. The scale of the theft was staggering. Joy put a weary hand on my shoulder. "This is bad, Julian," she said. "He knew we'd find the corporate theft, but this offshore scheme is another level." She then pointed to a final set of papers. "And look where the money trail leads." The final banking transaction documentation showed the money was funneled through an account with an identical name to my family trust. Roy's last, malicious act was to perfectly frame me for his offshore crimes. By running the siphoned money through a shell corporation with a name similar to my grandfather's trust, he created a believable, though false, narrative that the money had been secretly returned to the Hayes family. The media, which loves scandal and quickly tires of quiet corporate justice, turned on me. The headlines screamed about the son of an embezzler completes the crime, and Sterling's 75% owner took the money offshore. The stock price crashed almost immediately. Joy rushed into my office, her face grave. "Roy is out on bail already," she warned. "He's feeding the press every lie he can think of. The Financial Crimes Unit is opening an investigation. You have 48 hours to prove your innocence, or they'll freeze all of Sterling's assets." I felt the weight of my father's past shame descend on me again, heavy and cold. Just as I was about to sink into despair, I noticed something small and out of place on my desk, a thick, old encrypted drive. It looked like a flash drive from the early 2000s, perfectly camouflaged among modern office supplies. I knew instantly it was a gift from my grandfather. I rushed back to my apartment and immediately plugged the encrypted drive into a private, secure computer. I input a password combination based on an old joke my grandfather and I shared. The drive clicked open, revealing a series of video messages. They were from my grandfather, John Paul Hayes, recorded shortly before he died. He spoke slowly, sadly, knowing exactly what kind of man Roy was. "Julian," his voice was gentle, "I knew this day would come. Roy is greedy. You will need proof he can't destroy." The drive contained not just instructions, but a hidden digital map and evidence files that detailed Roy's earliest crimes. The map led me to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a place that had been quietly owned by Sterling for decades and was not listed on any current public records. Following my grandfather's detailed guidance, I drove out there late that night. I found a loose brick in a far corner, pulled it out, and behind it was a small, dusty safe. Inside, I found the physical proof, ledgers, signed receipts, and banking records that clearly showed Roy was laundering money through his original shell companies, and even more shockingly, doing it under the signatures of several key board members, who were all completely unaware they were being used. The next day, I didn't hold a press conference. I went straight to the Financial Crimes Unit, accompanied by Joy and my new legal team. I placed the massive amount of physical and digital evidence on the lead investigator's desk. The sheer volume and damning clarity of the documents, especially the ones linking Roy directly to the shell company used to frame me, were undeniable. The investigations began immediately, turning the full force of the government's legal power against Roy. Joy urged me to go public with the new evidence immediately, to tell the world how Roy had framed me. "You can't let them win the press war, Julian," she insisted. I took her advice. I held a short, quiet press conference, showing the ledger where Roy had written his own confessions, the very proof he thought he had destroyed years ago. The media, which had once called me a criminal, quickly changed its tune. They had a new narrative now: the man they tried to erase cleans up Sterling. The social pressure shifted instantly. The stock market, sensing a real change in management, stabilized and started to climb back up. The tide had truly, finally turned in my favor. With the legal battle finally turning in my favor, I focused on healing the company's reputation. Roy had always viewed Sterling as a source of personal wealth, cutting every division that didn't immediately generate profit. One of the first things he had shut down was the Sterling Community Outreach, a charitable division my grandfather had personally founded. I immediately announced its full reopening and restructuring, pledging a significant portion of the company's new profits to fund local schools and community projects. The shift in focus was immediate and profound. The employees, exhausted by Roy's greed and paranoia, saw a genuine return to the company's founding integrity. They began to rally behind me in a way they never had before. They were proud to work at Sterling again. I felt a huge wave of relief and satisfaction. But the moment of peace was short-lived. Joy called me that evening with a grave tone. "Roy made bail," she warned. "He is plotting revenge and he has nothing left to lose. He's going to attack something fundamental, something he knows will hurt you most." Roy's final act of desperation was a digital strike. He hired a team of elite hackers with one mission: to completely destroy Sterling's computer systems during the most vulnerable time possible, the annual shareholders' meeting. This was the day I was scheduled to give my first address as the majority owner and present the company's new ethical vision. Roy wanted to turn my moment of triumph into a public, digital catastrophe. But, again, I was already ahead of him. My grandfather's advice had taught me to always assume the worst. My new head of IT, a brilliant woman named Shani, had not only boosted our security but had laid a perfect digital trap. The moment the external hackers made their first deep penetration, Shani's counterprogram took over. It didn't fight the hackers, it simply hijacked their connection and traced the origin of the attack. The hack didn't destroy our systems. Instead, it was instantly routed back to the hacker's command center, which was a tiny, poorly secured apartment. The video feed from the hacker's own webcams, showing Roy Rice sitting right behind them, directing the attack, was immediately broadcast live onto the massive screens in the shareholders' meeting. The atmosphere in the boardroom was electric. Roy Rice, out on bail, was arrested mid-broadcast on the massive screens, caught red-handed directing an act of corporate sabotage. I watched his final, venomous expression as the police led him away. The room erupted in applause. But I didn't join in. I stood at the podium and felt no joy, no triumph. Instead, I felt a deep, cold sadness. I had won, but the cost had been years of pain, betrayal, and the deep, ugly understanding of how power could corrupt even the most ordinary people. I gave my speech not about profit, but about integrity, about rebuilding a corporate culture that valued people over greed. I decided to restructure the company entirely, moving away from the cutthroat competitive environment that allowed men like Roy to thrive. I wanted Sterling to be a force for good. That night, as I sat alone in my office, a heavy envelope was delivered by a guard. It was a letter, written on prison stationery, from Roy. It was not an apology. It was a threat. "It's not over, Hayes. You haven't won yet." Roy's prison letter was simply the fuel I needed to ensure the corruption was fully purged. I started going through my grandfather John Paul's old belongings, searching for any final piece of wisdom or instruction. I found an old, worn, leather-bound company journal, a personal diary that John Paul had kept in the early days of Sterling. I sat for hours, reading his elegant script. It detailed Sterling's original vision, a company built on integrity, fairness, and a deep commitment to the community. He wrote about creating a legacy that would lift people up, not crush them. I vowed to rebuild the company in that image. I needed to remove every last vestige of Roy's poison. As I turned a fragile, yellowed page near the back, a loose piece of paper fell out. It was another single sheet, a copy of a banking document, hidden inside a hollowed-out compartment of the journal's spine. On it was a single, undeniable, criminal signature, not Roy's, but his father's, linking the Hale family to even deeper crimes of industrial espionage and illegal asset stripping decades ago. It wasn't just Roy, it was a generational rot. The process of cleansing Sterling was not fast, but it was absolute. Armed with the final piece of evidence detailing the Hale family's long history of corruption, I called an immediate board meeting. Using my authority, I systematically purged every remaining link to Roy's network. Firing half the board and replacing them with proven, ethical leaders who shared my grandfather's original vision. I reorganized the financial structure, adding layers of external oversight to prevent any future fraud. I was rebuilding from scratch, creating a completely new Sterling. Weeks later, I walked through the main lobby. The employees, who had watched the drama and the purge, didn't scatter. They all stood up, spontaneously, and began to applaud. It wasn't applause for a new boss, it was applause for a new beginning. I was no longer the man they had seen fired on video, I was the man who cleaned up the mess and gave them back their company's soul. As I reached my office, a nervous, quiet knock came at the door. It was Felix, Roy's son, a quiet young man who had worked in the mailroom. He looked terrified. He had come with a final, desperate warning. Felix, Roy's son, was scared to death. He apologized for his father's actions, but he quickly delivered a final, chilling message. My father had a backup plan, he whispered, looking over his shoulder. He signed a dormant petition months ago. It's a secret clause that allows a vote to dissolve Sterling completely if he were ever permanently removed from power and arrested. Roy couldn't win, but he could ensure no one else could either. This desperate, final measure was Roy's ultimate act of corporate nihilism. The legal trigger for the vote was tied to a midnight deadline that very night. I immediately called Joy. We had to find the petition and nullify it before the deadline. We quickly discovered that the papers required 3 final, executive signatures to be immediately withdrawn. We had 2, but the third was still missing. That third signature was a special clause, requiring the majority owner to sign off, an act that would bind the company to my new ethical charter and void the dissolution petition forever. The clock was ticking toward midnight. One single, vital, final signature was missing, and the fate of Sterling Industries hung in the balance. The final scene unfolded with a terrifying urgency. I rushed out of the office, carrying the final petition papers. A fierce thunderstorm had broken out, mirroring the chaos of the night. Rain lashed down in sheets, and the city was plunged into a dizzying cycle of power outages. My car splashed through flooded streets as I raced toward the private safe where Joy had the binding charter ready. The clock on my dashboard glowed a furious, pulsing red. I burst into the small, dark building, the sound of the rain and thunder deafening. Joy was already there, holding the final document. The only light came from a flickering backup lamp. I grabbed the pen, my hand steady despite the adrenaline and the panic. As I brought the pen down to the paper to sign the final, majority owner's signature, a massive crack of lightning split the sky. The power surged. I finished the stroke, my name now legally and irrevocably tied to the fate of Sterling. Saving the company just as the clock in the building chimed midnight. I stood in the old boardroom, the one where Roy had fired me, now clean and empty. I looked out the window at the rain-washed city, the new owner of a new company. I was calm, resolute, and completely at peace. I looked down at the documents, a faint smile returning to my face. I had been fired, humiliated, and framed. I had been told I would never work here again. I whispered the final words of my triumph into the empty room. You were right, Roy. I'll never work here again, because now, I own it. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the playlist now.